Here, you know that we talked about the escape to Egypt, and we talked about how Jesus had traveled into Egypt as an escape, but also that he traveled into our Egypts, as in our places of oppression and our strongholds of slavery to sin. And then I talked about how from the earliest moments Jesus was on the move in his life. Even before he was born, Jesus was on the move. And he was traveling for us, going where we went and where we were lost and where we could not go alone. And in that message, I sort of missed an opportunity, I think, to fill you in on just how far some of these places were that folks were traveling to. And so I thought I would kind of back up and give you a little background on that. And for instance, it's about 80 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem. So that's about how far and how long Mary and Joseph traveled in order to register for the census that was being taken and also to give birth to Jesus. And then it was about roughly 6 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. I've heard anywhere between 5, 6, 7, so we'll say 6 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And I ask you to remember that number of miles for something we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But something comes to mind when I read these accounts today, and I think of very pregnant women traveling great distance to bring a Savior into a world. And when I think about the Magi traveling from who knows where to see a newly born king, and the thought is this: it seems to me that anything worth it requires a great amount of effort to get to it. Do you guys agree with that? If something is worth it, it's going to take some work to arrive at that. And so I see that today. And I think of it as this too. I'm a big fan of science fiction. I'm a big fan of just space and galaxies and planets and stars and things. Space travel, I think, would be very cool. And so I've been thinking this week and thinking about how many people over the course of history have stood outside at night and have looked up at the sky and saw the moon and dreamed of reaching the moon. And how many people have done that since the world was created? And how many people could have possibly dreamed that one day mankind would actually travel all those miles through space to reach the surface of the moon? And I think it's incredible that that happened. And it took years and years to get there. In fact, from the moment that this dream that many, many people had was put into motion by our nation's space program, it took about 11 years to get there. And who can argue that a trip to the moon isn't one of the world's greatest achievements? The fact that we have an American flag stuck in the soil of the moon is amazing. And I think it's well worth the miles that we're traveling to get there. But we're not here to talk about moon landings today. We're here to talk about a greater journey, I believe, than even that one. We're talking about Matthew chapter 2 today that we just heard read, where we find the journey of the Magi from the east traveling to see God's own Son who had been born to save a lost world. And I think these guys are funny. I've got their gifts up here again. I always try to bring those in each year. But it's funny, I think, these guys, these wise men, or the three kings as we call them in our hymn we just sang. But we presume, I think, to know much more about them than we really do. For instance, if I were to ask you how many Magi there were, you would probably say 3, right? But in actuality, we're never told how many there were in the Scriptures, but we think there are 3 because we know there were 3 gifts. So I guess we just assumed at some point along the way that each gift was carried by one guy. And I don't know about you, but we just had a Christmas at our house, and I watched my brother-in-law carry in all the gifts himself. So it could be that one guy carried in all the gifts, maybe, I don't know. But we think there were 3. But maybe there were 2 that carried the 3 gifts, or maybe there were 4 that carried the 3 gifts. I don't know. And another thing is, think that the Magi were at the manger scene, which I've got the nativity over there. We think that they were there, but we're never told that they were at the manger. We're never told that. But we've taken the two gospel accounts of the birth and we've sort of merged them together from Luke and from Matthew, and we've come up with this beautiful little nativity scene where everybody's there that night and we're all enjoying the birth of the Christ at the same time, but we're never told that. In fact, the Scriptures reveal otherwise. If we're looking at verse 11, it says, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. So there's never a mention of a stable or a manger, but they're saying a house. And they're saying that a child was there, not a baby lying in swaddling cloths, as we hear at Christmas Eve, but we're told that they were at a house and there was a child there. So the indication is that Joseph and Mary found a place to live for a while there following the birth, and they lived in Bethlehem until, as was customary for Joseph, he got a dream and an angel told him it was time to move again. And there's more. For instance, when Herod calls the Magi to him secretly, he asks them when the star appeared. And then he tells the Magi in verse 8 to make a careful search for the child. Not the baby, not the infant, but for the child. And we have good reason to believe that these men who came from the east were most likely coming from Persia, Iraq, Iran area. That's what the east was. That's the region that they were referring to as the east. So if that's the case, which would fit the story, then these men were traveling about 800 or 900 miles in order to get there to see the Christ child. So if for instance, that star appeared on the night he was born, and they made short work of getting ready and started heading to see this newborn king, then it would have taken them probably about 2 years to get there to Bethlehem to see Jesus the Savior. And that fits well into our passage today, because once Herod realizes, and we read this last week with the flight to Egypt, once Herod realizes that he's been outfoxed by these wise men, he sends out a decree to have all the boys in Bethlehem vicinity killed who are 2 years old or younger. He wants to make sure he's wiping out this person who will ascend to his throne, he feels. And so clearly Herod had some idea of about how long after that birth that the Magi had been traveling and when that star first appeared. So we clearly don't know a lot about the Magi, but what we do know is that these men were willing to travel and travel a great distance to see Jesus. A long, long journey these men embarked on to see the Savior of the world. And no doubt they endured a lot, I believe, on that 800 or 900 mile journey. Again, we're not told what happens during that, but I imagine being out there crossing the desert and things as they were. There were sandstorms and awful weather conditions. I can imagine, we're never really told. We always see them riding camels and things like that. I've got a picture of that on the bulletin today. But maybe a camel got sick along the way, or whatever pack maybe they brought along with them. Maybe they ran out of supplies along the way, kind of like running out of gas like we would today if we were traveling. And I'm just trying to imagine if they were riding camels and they had been riding a camel for 2 years, what their rear ends would have felt like. It could not be a good situation. And so to see this, it amazes me that these men made this journey all this way just to see Jesus, just to check out this situation. They had heard the story, they had read the Scriptures, and they wanted to see this for themselves. To see the one who had come so far himself to this earth. Now remember that point I asked you to remember, the 6 miles, the distance of 6 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. It was 6 miles from Jerusalem where King Herod lived, where the scribes, or the teachers of the law and the priests lived who could see this themselves. They all lived in Jerusalem, and it was 6 miles to Bethlehem where Jesus was born. And do we find Herod going to see the Savior? Do we find Herod bothering to take a short trip 6 miles is not that long. Take a short trip from his palace to the birthplace of the